Now going on to the fifth movie in this VHS series, we have VHS 99, which one thing I do want to say before we talk about this one in detail is I don't really know like what the reception on this series is, and I don't really know where the fan base lies one way or the other. So I don't know when I'm like preaching to the choir or saying something controversial or somewhere in between. But personally, for me, and I'm shooting this before VHS Halloween isn't out yet. This is still in September that I'm shooting this. But as of now, with the 7 that we have, I feel like, personally, I can safely say that this one is my favorite one after the first movie. So, going in with that, I'd say we can go right into the first segment, which is Shredding, which is by a writer and director, Maggie Levin. Right away, this one dives right into the 90s setting that we kind of set up in 94, but this one I feel like goes much more into the 90s culture as it presents its segments. And in this one, we do have this very authentic capture of like that 90s culture in this little intro video where we're establishing all the characters, and I love that we're able to do both of those things where it doesn't feel like it's just being like 90s for the sake of it. It is really kind of giving us a setting and also showing us the characters themselves, particularly the character Onker, who is this sort of group punching bag between them, and we get sort of all the different personalities. Sometimes they're clashing and they're showing off this punk attitude and all that. So just very, very 90s. And so, and it feels like as far as authenticity, it does feel like an actual video where if, you know, these characters did grow up, which we know that they don't, were to look back on this as adults, it's something they just kind of laugh and cringe about. And it actually does feel like that. And so after that, we get this cool sort of background story of Bitch Cat's death, the band that they essentially, I don't know if it's worship, but they were a worshipped band in general, and were ultimately trampled by their fans when their venue caught on fire. And that's one of those things that does feel like this actual urban legend that you would hear, this actual ghost story or whatever, and this something that would go through the rumor mill and sort of build and get more exaggerated as it goes. And we actually do get introduced to Bitch Cat as well through this sort of documentary. It feels like the more official version of the intro video that we saw with the sort of wannabe band that we're looking at amongst our main characters, and kind of seeing that parallel between them of this is what they strive to be, and this is what they are. And there's something so eerie about when we're seeing this Bitch Cat documentary, how it's like the film keeps warping, and it's giving off these really uneasy feelings as we're introduced to who is potentially going to be the threat of this story once the band actually gets to the venue. And as we're getting to the setting of this venue, the Colony Underground, there's just immediately this really haunted feel, like everything is charred and abandoned, and we already have it in our heads, like, what happened here, and Onker says it still smells like fire, and it's been like 3 years since the whole thing happened. There's like evidence of somebody living there. There's like a whole shrine. And we get these details on the way in where Onker is like the only one that's prepared, and he knows about like possessions and the terminology and all that. And of course, nobody else is listening, but he has all of his like defensive spices and stuff like that. And there's just this really growing vibe that there really is something supernatural going on here. And that's when we reach a point, because we've talked about one of the staples of this franchise is these segments are populated by characters that are assholes. And so we see them take that to an entirely new level. Like, there's being punk, and then there's what they do. Because obviously it's one thing to want to literally dance on the gravesite of another band, but also this idea of filling, this sadistic idea to fill sex dolls with red jello and stomp on them to recreate their deaths in the place that they died for a music video. And it's at that point, I feel like there's like a crossing of the line there. Like, they're already assholes doing something they shouldn't be, and being very morbid about this whole thing. But it's at this particular moment where it definitely feels like we've crossed into another line, into something terrible is definitely about to happen. Even more so than we thought. And, like, there's this overwhelming, like, superstitious feeling that takes over. And it's really, like, coming through the screen. Like, you really feel that this was a very, very bad idea. And then naturally it escalates the way you would think, where they do come back, they're zombified, and I love how we see them at first from a distance, like silhouetted against the red, and then they appear and they sort of recreate that documentary, only now they're like in freaky zombie form, and then we see our wannabe band that we've been watching dismembered, just completely in pieces, ultimately culminating in this image that stuck with me for a very long time after I saw this for the first time, where they have reassembled the band and they're sort of puppeting them to play while their dismembered bodies are like clearly crudely put back together, and it's really disturbing and freaky. But I also remember loving how much it stuck with me and how much it got under my skin. So this one has always had kind of a big impact on me, I think, and it's a really big way to open the movie as a whole. Now we go on to the second segment, which is called Suicide Bid, and is by Johannes Roberts, who did the 47 Meters Down movies and The Strangers Pray at Night and that other Resident Evil movie. This one feels like it's a bit of a curveball when you look at the rest of his filmography, where we start with this character Lily, who is pretty likable from the start, or she seems likable, where she turns on the camera and we spend some time with her by herself while she's building up trying to get into this sorority and trying to sell herself to them. And like I said, she seems likable enough, and then her friend comes in, her innocent friend comes in, and they're talking, and then it's kind of it's revealed that this is like a suicide bid thing, and then she kind of casts her friend out when her friend's talking about, like, the us of it, and she just kind of snidely says, not us. And then we feel like we're kind of seeing another side of this character, but it goes back and forth, and I kind of like the idea of seeing this through a character that's not just kind of one thing, where it's like she could have just been, like, innocent, or she could have been like the sorority girls. And it's, at the end of the day, it does just seem like somebody that fell victim to peer pressure in a really big way. And then they take her to this mausoleum that's like this, it has this big cathedral-like quality to it. Then they go out back and we realize where the grave is and where this is going to be happening, which is actually dug in the dirt and the mud, and she's going to go down in there and stay there for presumably the night. And what's great about this is taking, like we were talking about in the previous segment, that urban legend kind of feeling where this is another sort of fun background story, and then adding in the buried alive scenario on top of it. It really gives it this great sort of campfire story vibe. Then you add in this other layer of betrayal, where she's in there with things that can supposedly help her if she should start to panic or feel like she's running out of air or whatever. And she's given this box by this girl that sort of comforts her, and says, like, you know, it's doubtful that Annie's actually going to leave you down there all night, but here, just take this box and you'll be okay. And that's the box that happens to be full of spiders. And it's like, once that's revealed, it's like nobody's trustworthy and everybody was setting out maliciously. And in between, we still have those character moments where it's like she almost panics and almost rings the bell, and then stops herself and comforts herself by basically shit-talking her friend. And then we get that moment where things start to really escalate, and then just immediately, after she's been abandoned, she has that remorse and immediately apologizes, and that's where her friend and the library is where she wishes she was now. And when you feel that remorse starting to kick in, it does actually add this sort of reality to the terror of it. Like, you really feel that when her whole attitude changes so drastically, just completely 180s, as it's very clear this is getting scarier, adding on the fact that it starts raining, and that starts coming into this coffin and leaking in, and starts filling underneath her. And it's going to be very hard to mess up putting terror in a buried alive scenario. It just comes with the territory. And this does a pretty great job of adding in those other elements, like the water leaking in, and like the spiders, and the feeling of betrayal and abandonment. And that's before you get to the point that the spirit of the girl that was the subject of this urban legend has now come and shown. And I love the idea of being able to see through the cross so that we can see the face of this ghoul, or whatever you want to call it, breaking into the coffin. And just when you think that could be a very effective and horrifying ending, we do get this satisfying payoff where the tables are turned and it sort of becomes a revenge scenario where she's offered the souls of the sorority girls in exchange for her own, and we get to see them in the terror that they created. Finishing off with that image of the spider crawling slowly out of the ghoul's mouth. And there's a lot in this one that's really appealing, and like I said, really adds that sort of campfire story factor and urban legend factor with a scenario we've seen in horror many times but is always going to be effective. And then adding in a freaky ghost story on top of that, and a freaky design and reveal and all that. So this one is a lot of fun and also has really palpable terror in it. So the third segment is Ozzy's Dungeon by Flying Lotus, and this is a particularly fun one because we kind of get to go down different paths of the 90s nostalgia kind of thing. Because we start in kind of the earlier 90s where we have this game that's this game show with children that's clearly this combination of like Legends of the Hidden Temple and Double Dare and a few other things thrown in to make it just a little more sadistic, and throwing in all these other elements of the early 90s, like the inexplicable hip-hop to kind of open the show, and the host is quoting Ace Ventura, and Stephen Ogg as the host, who is amazing in this segment. And as they're going through him, we see him he very much like looks down on the kids, and he like makes snide comments and roasts them. And even when one kid has a horrific injury that nearly takes their leg off entirely, he's just making comments. And nobody has any regard for these kids whatsoever. Then once that's established, we do go to the 99 of the title, and like the show has been canceled and everything's in the past now, but this family has now gone crazy, and the girl who was injured, her leg is now all like mangled and decaying. And then we reveal the host, who has been kidnapped and is being kept in a cage in his underwear, who's going to be taken through his own obstacle course that the family, mainly the mother, has set up, and to give him the sort of same humiliation and grueling experience that the kids were put through. But this is going to shift a little bit in a very interesting way in regards to us potentially being on the mother's side at any point of this, which kind of throws an interesting wrench into what's going on here, to where it does for a long time feel like it's a segment that's basically about revenge and comeuppance for somebody like this host and the people that make this show and exploit kids. And this goes on for some time, for long enough that you think it's going to basically be the entire segment. Like maybe at the end, after he goes through the course, they're just going to kill him or something, and that'll be the end of it. But not quite. And this is where I'm of two minds about this segment and how it continues. Because he does say that there actually is an Ozzy, and he actually can grant a wish, as was the game show's setup. And of course there's a great cut after all this insanity to just the awkward car ride there. I love that, like, at any other time they probably would have just cut to them going into the dungeon and the cave and all that, but I like that we added, like, just the awkwardness of the car ride over after everything that just happened. And then, yeah, it does get to this point of us realizing that the whole point really is talking about the parents who are willing to put their kids through that torture to begin with for success, a success that they can capitalize on and can call their own, when the kid is the one that has to do all the work and go through it and all of that. The whole, child-starved story. And that there was likely a lot of when these child game shows were really, really big like they were in this era. And there weren't as many, rules and regulations to prevent things like this. Like it was just kind of the Wild West for stuff like this. Which is something a lot of people seem to think about fondly when they look back on, the era of the 90s or the 80s or whatever. The thing I was never really quite sure about with this segment, or how I felt about it, was the fact that it is literally a monster in a cave. And it does feel like it's one of those cases where it's taking it to another level in a way of, if you had just kind of stuck to what you were doing, it probably would have... That's probably what was most effective. This almost seems like going that extra level is a little too much. But I think it does ultimately make up for it, that this is a really nice payoff where the one wish that the girl has is to take out not just the host, but her entire family also, and just everybody that put her through this for basically their own gain. And the footage stopping and ending on this sort of sinister smile, that was the only wish she really needed, and that's kind of, there's still another revenge arc to everything that happened here, but the revenge was on a lot more people than we initially thought it was. This next one, The Gawkers, which is by Tyler McIntyre, is interesting because you'll notice that in this particular VHS movie, there's not a typical wraparound story like there usually is. We've just been seeing these sort of stop-motion little clips of somebody playing with, like, army men and action figures and stuff like that, and telling their own little outlandish story that's not really connected to much of anything. And it turned out we were really just seeing glimpses of this segment before we got to it. And so it turns out he was borrowing this camera, and when we see his brother and friends going around doing pranks and trying to look up a girl's skirt and stuff like that, and it's like, as usual, which is the VHS staple we were just talking about, we're following assholes who are basically asking for something horrible to happen to them. But like we've also talked about, there actually is an authenticity to these assholes. Like, these actually feel like authentic 90s teens. So these actors do a very good job, and their dialogue, as throwaway or ridiculous as it might sound, does sound very familiar to the 90s. And then we get a little clue here and there. There's the moment where they find the really big snake skin, and then they just kind of go along their way. Because that's the kind of thing you would do. You ran around with a camera and you'd find something that was kind of odd, and then you just go on to the next thing, and wouldn't think anything of it. And this would be about the time that they start fixating on the hot neighbor. And then this is kind of what the segment becomes for a little while. And they throw in these, little 90s things like your top three, crushes are Sarah Michelle Gellar and Britney Spears and the hot neighbor they're looking at. And it's like those being like the quintessential 90s crushes is something that brings memories back. Then while they're spying on her, they're having this throwaway conversation about like what the perfect concert would be or something, and it's like Limp Bizkit and Creed and Hole, and it's like, by that point it almost feels a little on the nose. It's probably very on the nose as far as bringing the 90s element into it, but it does still feel like you are actually watching a whole movie from the 90s. So as you can see, it does feel like this one is much more about the build-up rather than this constant, string of terror. And so you can get swept up in this, authentic feeling of the 90s and these characters just being who they are. And then there's just this underlying thing of, okay, but where is this going? Obviously something terrible is going to happen with the way they keep watching this neighborhood. What is it leading to? And then there's another moment that just seems very throwaway where they see statues. Now, of course, that's kind of the reveal to us, the audience, of what's probably about to happen here, but they have no idea. So this is when we're kind of in the know and they aren't, and we can start to anticipate more about how exactly is this going to escalate into what we think is happening here. So we have the whole American Pie sequence where the brother was able to sneak in and they're able to spy on her through her webcam. And while she's stripping, she's able to reveal and take her hair off and show that she is a Gorgon, the Medusa type thing, where you make eye contact with her and you turn to stone, and she has snakes for hair and all that. And I love the moment they threw in there where they're seeing this and they're all horrified and they're starting to scream, and you can still hear like one guy in the background go, "She's still kind of hot," but you can hear the fear in his voice. And yeah, then we get our typical monster ending that we've been building to, where she comes over. It is cool when we hear her like on the roof before she gets into the house. And then, naturally, they're all attacked. The first guy is ripped to pieces, which is pretty surprising when you're expecting the whole just turning to stone thing. But then that is where we leave. And that is a pretty great note to end on, where we sense that the person holding the camera has frozen into stone, and the monster is coming towards the camera before it cuts off. So it's a lot of build-up for a payoff that we can kind of see coming, but there's still a lot of fun things thrown in there. So the final segment is To Hell and Back, which is built up with the tagline that's on the poster, where it promises VHS goes to hell. And what's really interesting is this one following up the Gawkers, and how we talked about how the Gawkers is basically just all build up and then just a final last-minute payoff. This one starts right away, and it tells us exactly what's going on, and the horror of it is right here, where we start with a coven of witches who are getting ready to offer this subject as a vessel for this demon. And she's talking to the camera, and she's very happy about this. She's very happy to volunteer and do this for these witches. And so we see this happening, and then there's the guys sort of recording this and setting this up, and this unexpected moment where a demon pops out from under the table and pulls them into hell, and that's going to be what the actual segment is. So there's almost like, it starts off with like a facade of this segment could pretty much be anything after this demon is summoned, but instead they go to where the demon is, and it becomes this whole unexpected thing, which is maybe one of, if not the most ambitious segment in the VHS franchise, of these guys down in hell, and we get all this imagery of like there's the giant silhouette, the winged silhouette that's like above the mountains. There, and it's kind of funny also too, because it's a New Year's thing, it's a Y2K party, of course. So when we see them running around and there's all this hellish imagery everywhere, and we just see this guy still wearing like this cheap paper party hat the whole time. It's just the contrasting imagery is quite funny. And then we introduce this character that kind of takes us around with Mabel the Skullbiter, who has this very cartoonish voice, but is also very vicious and lives up to her name, and keeps appearing and disappearing. She's like the shark in Jaws. You never quite know where she is or where she's going to pop up again. Melanie Stone, I think is the actress's name. Major props to her for this performance and going all in. And like I said, just how this hell setting, and how just everything feels endless. Like, they have a timer. They have like 4 minutes left before they lose the ability to get out of hell. And you can feel that countdown, because when they look around, it's just like, there's just no way this is happening. Like, he actually starts to cry, and he's like, there's no way we can get out of here in 4 minutes. And it gives you this idea of being stranded in this foreign place, but unlike any way that any height that feeling has ever reached, could not possibly top being in this particular scenario. And there's all kinds of different creatures everywhere, and different designed creatures. There's like this, it looks like a sleeping baby, but it's like a guard, I think. It's got like this trident or staff or something that's made to stab that does come into play. There's a lot of stabbing and blood, like all at the last minute here. There's just body parts and organs spread everywhere. There's this faceless crouching person. There's this woman that's calling for help, and at first they think like it's Mabel, but then it's like, oh no, that can't be Mabel because the voice sounds a lot friendlier. And then when they find this thing and it raises its head, we realize, oh no, that's like a freaky demon monster of some kind. That in itself is a jump scare before the rest of the body comes out and we see entirely what it looks like. And it's just this endless array of insane imagery and insane designs and insane creatures. Basically, like we imagine hell itself, just endless terror. And it's just this really huge, ambitious production that should be commended. And then, of course, we meet the demon that we've kept hearing about, and we see that design and the way they're able to... That's their portal to get back through. And then, of course, the ultimate payoff being... This pretty unexpected payoff being that one of them doesn't end up in their body, but in the body of the person that was supposed to be the vessel. And when they realize it's all gone wrong, that's how they went through all of that and finally got out. And of course, in typical fashion in horror, if you've gone through something really, really horrific and you've made it the whole night and it's been this really grueling experience, there's a high likelihood that as soon as you're out of that experience, you're going to be killed immediately. And that's where we end up with this one. And there is that little payoff during the credits where, because he was able to write Mabel's name for whatever reason as he was dying, and then somewhere in the credits you can hear them like summoning Mabel, and so Mabel is going to be here in the real world now, and we can only imagine what that's going to lead to. So yeah, this one's got a lot of really big ideas, and they really wanted to go big for this one to end the movie on, and so they succeeded with that for sure. So like I was saying at the beginning, this is my favorite VHS movie after the first one, so the ranking does become a little difficult. And like I said, don't take it as like, something concrete or anything like that, but just for the sake of this part of our video, if I had to rank them from bottom to top, I guess I would put the Gawkers at the bottom, just because it's, like I said, it's one that's just sort of a lot of build up into a payoff that we can kind of see coming, and it's sort of the least memorable of these five, I think. But there's still plenty of quality in it, and I still like it just fine. Then I would probably go Suicide Bid. I'm kind of surprised this one's this low, because this is the kind of thing I look for in, like, short segments like this and short horror segments in this sort of anthology feel, because I really do just love the stuff that's like campfire story feeling and just simple, just like a simple ghost story and urban legend feeling. And this one delivers on all that. But because of the other segments, I am going to go ahead and put it at 4. 3, I'm going to go Ozzy's Dungeon. This is another one that does feel... So we just talked about the ambition of To Hell and Back. This one also has a lot of ambition in it and has a lot of moving parts in it and different layers to what it's talking about and what its payoff means and what kind of payoff we're ultimately looking for that it does deliver on when we get to it. And like I said, adding in all of like the 90s nostalgia, especially if you grew up with like the Nickelodeon shows and stuff like that, all of that's going to come through, and it is a really fun and crazy segment. Wild and crazy, I guess you could say. So here's the thing. I'm going to go with To Hell and Back at 2, because, like I said, there is a lot of ambition in it, and there is a lot of stuff going on, and they really, really went all out on this one, and I really do have to commend that. But the reason I'm putting Shredding at the top is because, like I said, these are fun, and they're freaky in their own sort of ways, but this one's the one, Shredding is the one that, like, really gets to me, like, really gets under my skin, and I genuinely find scary. Like, it gives me, like, the superstitious feelings of, oh, if I even watch this, am I, like, summoning something evil? And that's something that I just can't appreciate enough. Something that, like, genuinely puts me in that feeling and, like, genuinely gets to me. So I have to put Shredding at the top, even though it might seem much more modest compared to some of these other ones. That's the one that definitely gives me the strongest feelings. So that's going to be what that is, and that's going to be the end of this particular video. We've got 3 more of these. We've got 85 and beyond, and then Halloween will be out by then, and we'll be able to talk about that. And that'll be what these are. In the meantime, we'll be doing more of like the Poe and Price stuff, and I think there's some Stephen King stuff left. We're going to talk about a franchise towards the end and have a big video on Halloween and a bunch of other stuff. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.